Hi everyone, just in case you don't know me, my name is Miss Keel and I'm going to be talking to you about sporting injuries today that feature in the GCSE PE EdXL course. I do have to say to you now that we are going to be talking about injuries and there will be some pictures to do with strains and sprains. So if you do not like those sorts of things, be prepared, but it's not too bad, I promise. So first and foremost, please think about what do you know about injuries? I myself have had a fair share from broken bones to black eyes over the years. But what have you had in regards to injuries? You might have had none. You may have helped someone else. You may have seen something, but have a little think about what you know. So have a think about how many injuries can you name? In the pictures in front of you, you can see some examples of different sports. Could you name the different injuries? Could you give any famous sporting examples, not just the ones here, but have you seen or heard of others before? And do you know how to try and prevent injuries from happening? So they're the things we're going to be thinking about going forwards. On the next slide, we are going to look at some examples of injuries and see if you can guess what they are. So there are 5 different injuries here, and we're going to start up here. Now, I will say that all of the people featured in these are fine in the long run. So first and foremost, if we're looking up here, top left picture from the NFL, after a tackle, someone's landed on their head. What injury is that going to be? It's one that people can be dizzy, disorientated, and they must stop playing sport if you fear this. And you probably know this, that is a concussion. So one of the injuries we need to be aware of is a concussion. It's common in contact sports mostly, such as rugby, NFL, etc. But I've seen it happen on a netball court where two people have gone for the ball and hit heads. So you've got to be very, very wary. And if you ever suspect a concussion, the person does not play anymore until they have been assessed by a professional. So that leads us to why this is so important. As we look at these sporting injuries, we need to understand that, okay, yes, we need to try and prevent them, but we also need to be sensible when they do inevitably happen. And that's one really good example. So let's look at the next picture. So here we've got some bruising and it's like purple and it can be quite swollen. And this is a more common injury. And this is a sprain. Many of you may have experienced a sprain before, not to be muddled up with a strain that I'll explain in a minute, but a sprain happens when the ligament, which is the connective tissue that attaches bone to bone at joints, is stretched too much or is torn in extreme circumstances. So it's really important that if this happens in a sporting context, again, the person is stopped and treated, because that could be, that could escalate and the injury could get worse over time. Usually with these, you would treat them, as we will mention later, and you would hopefully see a difference in a few days. But there are different grades of sprains, and in a longer lesson, we'd look into that in more detail. So the next injury we're going to look at here, and if you haven't spotted it, concentrate on the leg. That's not a strain, that's not a sprain. That is, in fact, a fracture, the name given to a broken bone. So we're just looking at the kind of most common sporting injuries today. But what we need to understand with fractures, there are actually several different kinds, from green stick fractures, which happen in younger people, to compounded complex fractures. So a fracture happens as a result of a huge impact. So this was a collision with another player. A fracture obviously is a very serious injury and needs to be treated at hospital. But this is something that does happen sometimes in sports, and again, particularly football, because of the nature of people going for the ball and striking the legs. And obviously if they're twisted or collided with, unfortunately will cause a fracture. But a fracture is the proper word, not a broken bone, because again, the bone can be broken in different ways. Therefore, we call it a fracture, and the different fractures have different names. So we look at the one in the middle and we're thinking about this person and they're in the motion of stretching out for the ball and you can see there's a point of impact here. So as they hit that impact, what's going to happen to the muscles here? Well, they're going to really stretch. They're going to go beyond perhaps what they're used to. And this is what we call a strain, where someone overstretches or overreaches what they usually do. And again, that can cause soreness and achiness, and it's most common in the muscles, and hamstrings in particular is a common thing that gets strained. The last common sporting injury we're looking at the moment is here, and as you can see, his elbow's not quite in the right place. He's unfortunately lifted a weight and his body has not been able to sustain that, and his elbow has dislocated. So a dislocation happens at a joint, and that can be at the elbow, for example, here, which is a hinge joint, and it is where the bones move away from where they should be. Now, dislocations happen at joints, but there are different types of joint in the body, and usually obviously you would know a bit more about that, but most commonly they happen at the hinge joints, which are at the elbow and the knee, or the ball and socket joints. They are the hip and the shoulder is a common dislocation injury. The other things that are commonly dislocated are fingers, because of the nature of various sports, particularly volleyball. But again, it's where the joint moves away from where it should sit naturally. And that can actually cause strains and sprains as well, unfortunately, for those who have a dislocation. So they are 5 of the many examples of sporting injuries. These are 5 injuries that often happen due to unpredictability. And most of the time, everything has happened that should happen to prevent injuries. And this is just unfortunate. There are other sorts of injuries, for example, chronic injuries, which are overuse injuries, where you overwork an area of the body over time. And we'll talk more about that at a different date. But these are the kind of high impact injuries from unpredictable sports. Please know there are other injuries as well. These are just some examples. So how do we avoid this from happening? Can you think of any rules? So there are a few guidelines or rules that we should all abide by to avoid things like this from happening. Again, there is a certain inevitability about it, but there should never be an injury that could have been avoided. So first and foremost, if you're training, so if you're trying to improve your fitness, so this lady in yellow here, the first thing you need to consider is your training program, and you should have heard of this term. But the principles of training, if you are training, start thinking, what do you need to ensure? Do you go for the biggest weights? Do you go for the smallest weights? Do you go until you drop? Well, no, you design a training program that is designed for you and your needs using the principles of training. So making sure you're doing it regularly, but you are allowing yourself rest and recovery, that you change the fitness intensity, time and type of your training to suit your needs, but you are not overdoing it. So rule 1, make sure that your training program is designed using the principles of training. It's individual to you. So rule number 2, would you like to go and compete in either of these? I'm sure some of you would, but would you know how, and is that safe? What would happen if someone came to compete in your sport that you play and didn't know the rules? Would that be safe for them? Would that be safe for you? Well, I'm sure you know the answer is no. Please make sure that you play a sport where you understand the rules, because obviously if this is not the case, that could result in injury. So rule number 2, make sure you play and understand the rules. So play by the rules and understand the rules. Number 3, now this one worries me, this picture, because there is something missing. What if the batter here hit the ball straight back? There is nothing protecting the pitcher there, the person who is throwing the ball, called the pitcher in baseball. So make sure that you're wearing safety equipment when it's relevant to your sport. May it be shin pads, gum shields, helmets. It's really important that we make sure that we're wearing that appropriate protective items and clothing to prevent injuries. Rule 4, very simple here. Would you want to use that weights machine over here? This bat or this racket? Well, no. And how do you make sure you don't be in this situation? You check the equipment. Rule number 4, you always check the equipment before you use it. So rule 5, nice and simple, check the facilities or the area. Now, I know some of you would be quite happy playing out in the snow, but that doesn't mean it's safe to do so. A frozen pitch or a waterlogged pitch is not safe. Always check the facilities or the area to ensure there are no hazards. Now, we've got outside examples here, but if you're playing inside in the example of volleyball or futsal or inside netball, something you must ensure that there is no spillages from drinks, etc. on the court. There are no bags around the outside. And if people are lax in this and don't do these sorts of things, all it takes is for someone to try and chase a ball and keep it on court. And if there's a bag at the side of the court, well, they could trip over and they can do a strain or a sprain if they're lucky, or worse, they'd end up with a fracture. So it's really important that we understand that it's our responsibility to make sure the area we're playing in is safe. And rule 6, this is for everyone, everywhere, in every sport. To ensure that you don't get injured or help prevent injury, you need to warm up and cool down. And hopefully you guys know how many stages a warm up includes. And that is 3 is the magic number. It's a pulse raiser to increase oxygen delivery around the body to the working muscles. It is dynamic stretches in ways that you're about to move in the sport. And then you do your skill-based activity. So for football, you'd start passing. For netball, you'd pass and shoot, and so on. So always warm up and cool down properly. These are the rules to avoid the injury, avoid the dislocations, the strains, the sprains, the fractures. So please make sure you are following those. Please make sure you are aware of those. And if you do get injured, I would like you to think about rice. You might think I'm going mad. Rice is a way to treat injury. So if you are ever injured, so a strain or a sprain in particular, remember rice. And that stands for rest, stop what you're doing, go to the side, rest the injured part. Apply ice, ice. This reduces the swelling and also the pain often, but apply it for 10 minutes with 10 minutes on and 10 minutes off. The C in rice stands for compress, so you compress. Now, obviously, if someone had a broken bone, you're not going to press down hard, but you might just put some ice and again, make sure it's stable. And again, compressing an injury just helps reduce inflammation, and obviously it goes hand in hand with applying the ice. And the last bit of rice is the E, and that's elevate. So that is bring the body part that's injured above heart height is ideal. So ultimately, if I had hurt my ankle, if I sat on the floor and put my foot on the chair, that would be a great way to elevate. If it was my hand, simply putting it here would help, or even here if it was a cut, which we haven't spoken about yet. So always remember rice if you do have to treat injuries. So although it's a brief mini session today, we've talked about how to prevent injuries, identifying some different injuries, especially those ones found in a sporting context, and we've briefly looked at how to treat an injury. We'd go on from this to look at more chronic injuries, injuries of overuse or injuries from training incorrectly, and then we'll look at them in sporting specific examples as well. So I hope you found that interesting and a little taster for some of the things we'll learn in GCSE PE. And bye for now.